In the long silence before history learned to speak, the world was smaller, darker, and closer to the skin. Firelight trembled against cave walls, and beyond that fragile circle of warmth stretched forests without paths, nights without mercy, and animals whose eyes reflected the same hunger as our own. This was a time before monsters had names, before myths learned to sharpen their teeth. Yet the fear was already there, quiet, intimate, and deeply human. Long before the werewolf entered folklore, before it became a creature of moonlight and curse, humanity was haunted by a simpler, more unsettling question. Where did the human end, and where did the animal begin? Early humans did not imagine themselves as rulers of the natural world. They lived within it, exposed to its rhythms, its violence, and its indifference. Survival demanded vigilance. Hunger demanded movement. And fear was constant. In such a world, instinct was not something to be overcome. It was something to be trusted. The boundary between reason and impulse, between thought and reaction, was thin as skin stretched over bone. In caves scattered across Europe, Africa, and Asia, prehistoric hands pressed pigment into stone. The images they left behind are among the oldest human memories we possess. Bison in mid-charge, deer frozen in flight, lions carved in profile. But among these animals appear stranger figures, bodies shaped like men, heads shaped like beasts. Creatures that do not exist in nature, yet refuse to disappear from the human imagination. These were not stories meant to frighten children. They were questions carved into stone. What are we really? Anthropologists have long debated these hybrid figures. Some argue they represent shamans in ritual dress. Others see spirits, ancestors, or gods. But beneath these interpretations lies a more intimate truth. These images reflect a consciousness struggling to define itself. A mind aware that it thinks, yet knows it can still be overtaken by hunger, rage, lust, or fear. In those early centuries, transformation was not horror. It was recognition. To hunt was to imitate. To survive was to learn the movements of animals, their patience, their bursts of violence, their silence. Hunters studied wolves to understand endurance, bears to understand strength, cats to understand precision. Over time, imitation became ritual. Ritual became belief. And belief shaped identity. To move like the animal was to become closer to it. Not physically but spiritually. This closeness was not symbolic alone. In many early societies, humans believed animals possessed souls equal to their own. Some believed animals were ancestors. Others believed they were older beings, wiser beings, who had walked the earth before humans learned to speak. To cross into animal nature was not degradation. It was elevation, a return to something ancient and powerful. But this closeness also carried dread. Because animals did not restrain themselves. They did not bury their dead or hesitate before violence. They killed when they were hungry. They fought when threatened. They mated without shame. And humans, watching themselves capable of the same impulses, felt both awe and unease. Civilization, such as it was, existed to hold these instincts in place. But it was never certain they would stay there. The fear was not of becoming something else. The fear was of remembering something already inside. As communities grew and survival became more organized, instinct began to feel dangerous. What once protected could now destroy. A man who lost himself to rage could harm his own kin. A hunger unrestrained could lead to theft, exile, or death. Slowly, subtly, the animal within was no longer only revered. It was watched. This is where transformation changed its meaning. Not yet a curse, not yet a monster, but a threshold. A place where the self could slip. Mythology across early cultures reflects this tension. From the wolf warriors of ancient Indo-European tribes to the bear men of the Arctic, transformation stories appear wherever humans lived close to wilderness. These were not bedtime tales. They were explanations. Attempts to understand moments when people acted beyond reason, when strength exceeded expectation, when violence seemed inhuman. Psychology, long before it had a name, was already at work. Trauma, starvation, isolation, and ritual trance could alter perception. The human mind, under extreme conditions, can fracture, dissociate, or expand beyond ordinary awareness. Early societies did not call this illness. They called it possession, or blessing, or becoming. To them, identity was not fixed, flowed. And yet, even then, something was shifting. As language evolved and belief systems grew more structured, boundaries hardened. Humans began to define themselves not only by what they were, but by what they were not. The animal became the other. The forest became the unknown. The night became dangerous. Still, the memory lingered. The idea that beneath tools, laws, and rituals, there lived something older. Something that did not speak but acted. Something that could surface when fear stripped away reason. Something that did not need permission to exist. This was the soil from which the werewolf would eventually grow. Not as a monster born of superstition, but as a symbol forged from millennia of self-recognition. The werewolf is not merely about wolves. It is about loss of control. About the terror of watching the self dissolve into instinct. About the thinness of the line we draw between civilization and chaos. Before it howled at the moon, it whispered in the dark. Before it stalked villages, it lived in caves and memories. Before it had claws and curses, it was a question asked by firelight. What happens when the rules fall away? Even now, the question remains. Modern language calls it impulse, addiction, rage, psychosis. Ancient language called it transformation. The words have changed. The fear has not. Because beneath the skin of every age, beneath every law and belief, the animal waits, not to destroy us, but to remind us of what we are made from. And long before the beast had a name, it already lived within the human story, patient, watching, remembering. Before humanity learned to build walls, it learned to listen to the breathing of the world. The forest spoke in movement. The plains whispered through hooves and wind. And among these ancient rhythms, early humans did not see animals as lesser beings, but as older ones, teachers shaped by time, instinct, and survival. In that distant age, to wear the skin of an animal was not an act of deception. It was an act of approach. The hide carried memory. It held the warmth of a living body, the scent of earth and blood, the quiet authority of something that had survived without fire or language. When a human wrapped themselves in fur or leather, they were not pretending to be an animal. They were stepping closer to it, crossing a boundary that civilization had not yet drawn. Archaeology leaves us fragments of this truth. Cave paintings depict figures with human legs and animal heads. Antlers rise from human skulls carved in stone. In the deep chambers of Paleolithic caves, hunters painted themselves not as conquerors of beasts, but as kin, limbs blurred, identities merging, the line between man and animal softened into reverence. These images were not fantasy. They were theology. Across early Eurasia, Africa, and the Americas, animal skins functioned as sacred instruments. The hunter who wore the hide of a stag did not merely honor the kill. He accepted responsibility for it. The animal's strength, speed, and awareness were believed to linger in the skin, like an echo of its final breath. To wear it was to carry that echo into the human body. This belief was not symbolic alone. It was practical, psychological, and deeply embodied. Survival depended on understanding animals. Not just how they moved, but how they perceived the world. To hunt the wolf, one had to think like the wolf. To track the deer, one had to feel the forest as the deer did. Alert to silence, sensitive to fracture, responsive to fear. The skin became a bridge. Among early Siberian and Central Asian cultures, shamans wore the pelts of bears, wolves, and birds not as costumes, but as tools of transformation. The bear was strength and endurance. The wolf was loyalty and violence balanced by order. The bird was vision, the ability to move between earth and sky, life and death. Each skin reshaped the wearer's posture, breath, and sense of self. Anthropology tells us that these rituals often followed strict preparation. Fasting, isolation, chanting. The human body was weakened so that another presence could be felt. When the skin was finally placed upon the shoulders, it was believed that the animal's spirit recognized the offering, not as theft but as invitation. This was not domination over nature. It was submission to it. In many hunter-gatherer societies, killing an animal without ritual was considered dangerous. The spirit, unacknowledged, might follow the hunter home. Illness, madness, or misfortune were seen as signs of imbalance, a failure to honor the exchange between life taken and life continued. The skin corrected that imbalance. Said, I remember you. Carry you. I become you briefly, so your death is not forgotten. Even in early Indo-European traditions, the practice endured. Warriors donned wolf or bear skins before battle, not for intimidation alone, but for transformation. Roman writers later described these men with a mixture of fascination and dread. Fighters who howled, who seemed immune to pain, whose eyes burned with something unhuman. But Rome misunderstood what it witnessed. These warriors were not attempting to become monsters. They were attempting to step outside the fragile softness of humanity. Civilization had already begun to domesticate fear, to tame instinct, to place reason above survival. The skin offered a return, a controlled descent into something older, harsher, and more honest. Psychology recognizes this impulse even now. The human mind, when pushed to its limits, seeks archetypes, forms that embody power without hesitation. The animal represents instinct without doubt, hunger without shame, violence without moral fracture. To wear the skin was to quiet the noise of thought and let the body remember what it knew before language complicated it. Yet there was always a cost. Transformation rituals were temporary by design. To remain in the skin too long was dangerous. Myths warn of hunters who forgot to remove the hide, who lost their names, who returned unable to speak except in growls and gesture. These stories were not warnings against animals. They were warnings against imbalance. To become animal forever was to abandon memory, kinship, and restraint. Humanity required return. As societies grew more complex, this balance became harder to maintain. Agriculture distanced humans from the animals they once followed. Cities replaced forests. The skin, once sacred, began to look like savagery to those who no longer needed it. Ritual transformed into rumor. Reverence hardened into fear. By the time classical civilizations documented these practices, the meaning had already shifted. Greek and Roman writers described skin-wearing rituals as foreign, primitive, dangerous. The sacred logic behind them was lost in translation. What had once been communion was now caricature. Still, the memory lingered. Folklore preserved what history dismissed. Tales of men who became wolves, bears, or boars were not inventions of horror. They were fossils of belief. Beneath the fear lay an older truth. That humans once understood power not as domination, but as participation. The werewolf was not born as a monster. It was born as a ritual. Only later did religion and law recast the skin as evidence of sin. Christianity reframed transformation as temptation, the animal as the fallen self. The hide no longer carried wisdom, it carried corruption. To wear it was to reject divine order, to step backward into darkness. But this condemnation revealed an anxiety deeper than theology. Civilization feared what it could no longer control. The animal within the human did not disappear with cities and scripture. It was buried, suppressed, redirected. Yet in moments of war, famine, and collapse, it resurfaced. Raw, efficient, terrifying. The old rituals had acknowledged this truth and given it form. They taught when to enter the skin, and when to leave it behind. Without them, transformation became uncontrolled. Madness replaced ceremony. Fear replaced reverence. The skin of power still haunts us because it asks a question we have never fully answered. What did we lose when we stopped listening to the animal world? Not as resource but as mirror. In ancient hands, the hide was warm with meaning. Carried gratitude, memory, and restraint. It reminded humans that survival was borrowed, not owned. And perhaps that is why the image endures. Half man, half beast, standing at the edge of the firelight. Not as a warning of what we might become, but as a memory of what we once knew. That power does not always roar. Sometimes it waits quietly beneath the skin, remembering a time when wearing it meant understanding who you truly were. In the age before stone cities and written memory, the hunt was not an act of dominance. It was a conversation, quiet, dangerous, and sacred, spoken between human hands and animal breath. Before the world was divided into wilderness and home, there was only movement, herds migrating beneath wide skies, and small bands of humans following, listening, learning. To hunt was not simply to kill. It was to cross a threshold where survival and reverence shared the same fragile ground. The earliest hunters walked into forests and plains with the knowledge that they were not alone, nor superior. They believed the animals watched them with an ancient awareness, older than language, older than fear. Every hunt carried risk, not only of death but of imbalance. To take a life without permission, without ritual, was to invite misfortune. The world, they believed, remembered such transgressions. Across Paleolithic cave walls, the story survives in pigment and shadow. Bison, deer, horses, and aurochs stretch across stone, rendered with aching precision. These were not trophies. They were invocations. The animals were painted larger than the humans, often pierced with symbolic spears long before any real hunt began. To depict the animal was to reach toward its spirit, to ask, to prepare, to acknowledge a debt not yet paid. Anthropologists would later call this sympathetic magic. But for those who lived it, there was no abstraction. The hunt began long before blood touched soil. It began in fasting, in chant, in isolation. Hunters withdrew from the group, purifying themselves through hunger and silence. Their bodies grew light. Their senses sharpened. They were shedding the weight of the ordinary world, preparing to enter another. When the moment came, the act of killing was deliberate, controlled, and heavy with meaning. The animal was approached not as prey, but as participant. Many cultures believed the animal chose to give itself, or that its spirit would return in another form if treated with respect. A careless kill risked offending the unseen forces that governed fertility, weather, and survival itself. In the Arctic, Inuit hunters whispered apologies to the seal as they struck, believing its soul lingered, listening. In Siberia, reindeer bones were arranged carefully, ensuring the animal could be reborn. Among early Indo-European peoples, portions of the animal were never eaten, reserved instead for the spirits or returned to the earth. Nothing was wasted. Nothing was taken lightly. Blood, when it spilled, was not filth. It was power. Warm, steaming, alive with meaning. Hunters often smeared it onto their faces or hands, believing it carried strength, endurance, and memory. To touch blood was to touch the threshold between life and death, a place where transformation was possible. And transformation was the true purpose of the hunt. For a brief and dangerous moment, the hunter stepped outside the human role. Moving silently, watching the wind, reading tracks older than words, they entered an animal rhythm. Heartbeats slowed. Muscles responded without thought. In this state, identity blurred. The hunter did not merely chase the animal. They mirrored it. Predator and prey became reflections locked in ancient choreography. This belief, that one could absorb the essence of the animal, appears again and again across cultures separated by oceans and millennia. To eat the heart of a bear was to gain courage. To wear the antlers of a stag was to borrow vigilance. To run with wolves was not madness, but mastery of fear. Psychologically, these rituals carved a controlled space for violence. Killing was not denied, but transformed, contained within myth and meaning. The hunt allowed humans to face the terror of taking life without losing themselves to it. It placed boundaries around brutality, insisting it serve something larger than impulse. But the exchange was never one-sided. The animal, too, shaped the human. In many myths, those who hunted too well too often risked losing their way back. Stories warned of men who forgot their names, who lingered too long in the forest, who moved on all fours and answered only to hunger. These were not monsters yet, but they were cautions. Transformation was powerful, and power demanded restraint. Over time, the hunt became woven into initiation. Boys became men not through age, but through blood. They were sent into the wild to kill or nearly die. They returned marked, not just by scars but by silence. They had seen something. They had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. These rites did not celebrate violence. They acknowledged its cost. To kill was to accept responsibility not only for survival, but for memory. The animal would be remembered. Its story would be told. Songs preserved its sacrifice, ensuring it was not reduced to meat alone. As agriculture slowly replaced hunting, the sacred exchange did not vanish. Changed shape. Ritual hunts became symbolic. Masks replaced skins. Drums replaced pursuit. But the belief endured, that humans carried an animal self within them, one that could be awakened, borrowed, or feared. Later civilizations would forget this balance. The hunt would become sport. Animals would become resources. The old rituals would be dismissed as superstition. Yet something essential was lost in that forgetting, the understanding that transformation was not inherently monstrous. The earliest hunters knew something we struggle to remember. That to survive is to take life, and to take life is to be changed by it. They created ritual not to glorify the kill, but to survive its weight on the soul. Long before werewolves stalked folklore, before curses and moonlit madness, there was the hunt as holy rite. A moment when humanity stood at the edge of itself, neither fully beast nor fully civilized, breathing in cold air, listening for hoofbeats, preparing to become, just for a heartbeat, something other than human. And when the blood dried and the fire burned low, the hunter returned to the circle. Change. Quiet. Carrying the memory of another life within their own. Before the world was mapped and measured, before borders hardened and names became permanent, there existed a quieter authority. Not kings or priests, not warriors or builders, but those who listened. In the deep forests across tundra and desert, along riverbanks older than memory, shamans emerged as figures suspended between certainty and mystery. They did not rule societies. They interpreted them. They stood at the fragile seam between what was seen and what was felt, between the living and the unseen, between human breath and animal instinct. To ancient peoples, the world was not divided into nature and culture. It was a single, breathing organism. Mountains listened. Rivers remembered. Animals were not lesser beings, but parallel intelligences moving through the same sacred landscape. The shaman was the one who learned to cross that invisible threshold, not by transforming flesh, but by dissolving the boundaries of the self. Shamanic transformation did not begin with spectacle. It began with deprivation. Fasting until the body thinned and the mind loosened its grip on time. Isolation until language lost its authority. Pain, self-inflicted or ritualized, not as punishment, but as an instrument, stripping the ego down to its rawest nerve. Through this erosion of identity, something ancient stirred. Consciousness widened. The self became porous. In trance states induced by rhythm, breath, or sacred plants, shamans described journeys beyond the human horizon. They did not imagine becoming animals. They entered their way of being. The flight of birds was felt in the chest. The patience of predators slowed the heartbeat. The fearlessness of prey sharpened every sense. These were not metaphors. In the shamanic worldview, they were experiences as real as hunger or cold. Anthropology records this pattern across continents and millennia. From Siberian reindeer herders to Amazonian tribes, from early Indo-European cultures to the First Nations of North America, the shaman appears again and again, wrapped in hides adorned with bones, marked by symbols that blur the human silhouette. These garments were not costumes. They were thresholds. Wearing antlers or feathers was an act of alignment, a visual declaration that identity was fluid, negotiable, and sacred. To the tribe, the shaman was not feared as a monster, but trusted as a messenger. They returned from trance bearing knowledge that could not be gathered through hunting alone, warnings of famine, interpretations of illness, myths that explained suffering. Their visions became stories. Their stories became memory. And memory became survival. In a world governed by uncertainty, the shaman offered coherence. When animals vanished, when children sickened, when death arrived without reason, It was the shaman who ventured into the unseen to retrieve meaning. Illness was not merely physical. It was a sign of imbalance. The soul had wandered. The shaman followed. Psychology, millennia later, would struggle to name what shamans practiced intuitively. Dissociation, altered states, archetypal projection. Yet reducing these experiences to pathology misses their purpose. These states were not escapes from reality. They were engagements with it at its most primal level. The animal consciousness the shaman entered was not savage. It was precise, present, and unburdened by abstraction. Animals lived entirely within the moment. They did not fear death in advance or mourn the past. To borrow their awareness was to step outside the anxious spiral of human thought. In this sense, shamanic transformation was not about power. It was about humility, acknowledging that humanity was not the center of existence, but one expression among many. Over time, these practices shaped myth. Stories of humans who became bears, wolves, birds, or serpents did not begin as entertainment. They were records, poetic interpretations of trance journeys retold across generations. As oral traditions aged, nuance faded. The inner transformation hardened into literal belief. The soul's journey became the body's curse. But in their origin, these stories carried reverence, not fear. To cross into animal consciousness was to remember an older kinship. Long before agriculture fenced the land and language separated species, humans learned by watching animals. How to hunt, how to endure winter, how to read the sky. Shamans preserved this memory, carrying it inward when the world began to forget. There was danger in this crossing. Not all who ventured into trance returned whole. Some lingered too long in the animal mind, emerging restless, volatile, alienated from the tribe. Ancient cultures recognized this risk. Rituals were precise, boundaries carefully enforced. Transformation was temporary. Return was essential. This tension, the fear of losing oneself while seeking deeper truth, lies at the heart of every transformation myth that followed. The shaman stood as proof that the boundary could be crossed, but only with discipline, guidance, and respect. Without ritual, transformation became chaos. As civilizations grew and hierarchies hardened, the shaman's role became uncomfortable. Empires prefer fixed identities, clear laws, predictable behavior. The idea that a person could step outside their human role, could dissolve identity and return changed, was unsettling. Gradually, reverence turned to suspicion. What was once sacred became strange. Yet the memory endured. Even as shamans were marginalized, their imprint remained embedded in folklore. The wild man, the spirit walker, the one who knows the language of beasts. These figures haunt myth not because they were feared, but because they represented a freedom civilization could not fully suppress. At its core, shamanic transformation asks a question that still unsettles us. What remains when identity dissolves? When titles, names, and roles fall away, what consciousness remains beneath? The shaman's answer was not comforting, but it was honest. Beneath culture, beneath belief, there is an older awareness. Watchful, instinctive, alive. The werewolf, the berserker, the shapeshifter of later legend, all are echoes of this ancient practice, distorted by time and moral judgment. Where shamans sought balance, later societies saw threat. Where trance was once a tool for healing, it became a symbol of loss of control. But in the silence of deep forests, in the rhythmic beating of drums, the original truth lingers. Humans were never meant to be separate from the animal world, only distinct within it. The shaman remembered this when others forgot. And so, between breath and heartbeat, between human thought and animal instinct, the shaman stood, neither fully one nor the other. A bridge made of bone and memory. A witness to the truth that transformation does not begin with claws or fangs, but with the courage to step beyond the self. Because long before monsters haunted the night, there were guides who entered the darkness willingly, returning not as beasts, but as reminders of what humanity once was and quietly still is. Before the wolf became a symbol of terror, before its silhouette was sharpened into a monster by firelight and fear, it was something far older and far closer. In the deep memory of Indo-European peoples, the wolf did not stand apart from humanity. It stood beside it. It walked the same forests, drank from the same rivers, and hunted beneath the same indifferent sky. In those early ages, when the boundary between nature and culture had not yet hardened, the wolf was not an enemy. It was a relative. To understand this bond, we must step back into a world where ancestry was not traced only through bloodlines and names, but through shared survival. The wolf was the master of endurance, of cooperation, of movement across hostile land. Long before cities rose and laws were written, humans watched the wolf and recognized something unsettlingly familiar. Not savagery but order. Not chaos but discipline shaped by hunger and landscape. Across Indo-European mythologies, the wolf emerges not as a demon, but as a guide, a guardian, and sometimes even a progenitor. In the Roman imagination, it was a she-wolf who nursed Romulus and Remus, feeding the founders of an empire with her own body. This was not a story of wildness corrupting humanity, but of wildness sustaining it. Rome, for all its stone and steel, traced its origins not to gods alone, but to an animal mother who embodied resilience. Further north, among Germanic and Norse cultures, the wolf occupied a similarly complex role. Fenrir, the great wolf of Ragnarok, is often remembered as a destroyer, but he is also the inevitable force of time itself, a reminder that no order, however divine, is permanent. Wolves in these traditions were not meaningless beasts. They were cosmic participants, bound to fate and renewal, destruction and rebirth. Even the gods kept wolves at their side. Odin, the All-Father, was accompanied by Jerry and Freki, wolves whose names mean the ravenous and the greedy. They were not symbols of shame or excess, but reflections of necessary hunger. Odin fed them while he himself abstained, acknowledging that wisdom is incomplete without the raw instincts that sustain life. In these stories, to be wolf-like was not to lose humanity. It was to remember it. Anthropologically, this reverence was rooted in observation. Wolves hunt in packs, structured by hierarchy and cooperation. They care for their young. They defend territory with precision rather than frenzy. Early human societies, struggling to survive harsh climates and scarce resources, recognized in wolves a mirror of their own social instincts. The wolf became a living lesson in how to endure. This recognition bled into ritual and identity. In ancient Indo-European warrior cults, young men were often symbolically transformed into wolves. They left their communities, lived on the margins of society, and adopted animal behaviors during periods of initiation. These were not metaphors meant only to entertain. They were lived experiences, rites designed to strip away the comforts of civilization and expose the initiate to something older and more dangerous. To become wolf-like was to step backward in time, into an ancestral state where survival depended on instinct, silence, and the ability to read the land itself. It was believed that only by passing through this animal phase could one return as a true adult, tempered by the knowledge of what lies beneath human restraint. The Latin word lupus, wolf, echoes through Roman law, poetry, and psychology. Even the term lupaner, meaning brothel, reflects the deep association between wolves and raw, uncontrolled appetite. Yet this was not merely condemnation. It was acknowledgement. The wolf represented urges that civilization sought to manage, but could never erase. Psychologically, the wolf occupied a space that humans both needed and feared. It embodied the instincts required for survival: aggression, territoriality, loyalty to kin, but also threatened the fragile structures of order humans worked so hard to maintain. Reverence and fear existed side by side, not as opposites, but as companions. As societies grew more complex, agriculture replaced hunting, and permanent settlements softened humanity's relationship with the land. The wolf, once a teacher, became competition. Livestock replaced prey, and the wolf's hunger clashed directly with human ownership. What had once been kinship began to fracture. Yet the myths did not disappear. They lingered like bones beneath new foundations. Stories of wolf men, humans who could cross the boundary between species, persisted not as fantasy but as memory. These figures were not always cursed. In early traditions, they were protectors, warriors, liminal beings who stood between village and wilderness. They embodied the belief that humanity did not stand above nature, but within it. To become wolf-like, then, was not transformation into something lesser. It was a return to a forgotten truth, that humanity was shaped not only by reason, but by blood, cold, hunger, and shared struggle. Civilization offered safety, but it demanded amnesia. It required humans to forget where their strength came from. The wolf refused to let them forget. As Christianity spread across Europe, this ancestral bond grew uncomfortable. A faith centered on transcendence and moral order had little room for animal kinship. The wolf, once sacred, was reinterpreted as a symbol of temptation, heresy, and spiritual danger. Christ was the shepherd. The wolf became the threat to the flock. What had once been reverence was rewritten as warning. Yet even then, the wolf could not be fully cast out. It remained in folktales, dreams, and fears, no longer as ancestor but as shadow. The transformation myths survived, inverted but intact. Where once becoming wolf-like meant returning to ancestral wisdom, it now meant losing one's soul. This inversion tells us less about wolves than about ourselves. As societies moved further from nature, the instincts that once ensured survival became sources of guilt and anxiety. The wolf became the embodiment of everything civilization tried and failed to suppress. Still, beneath centuries of reinterpretation, the older memory persists. In quiet moments, in the pull of forests and the unease of moonlit silence, the wolf remains a reminder of origin. It is the echo of a time when humanity did not pretend to be separate from the world that made it. To the ancients, ancestry was not only human. It was ecological. It was spiritual. The wolf was family not because it was gentle, but because it was honest. It lived according to the same laws that once governed us all. And perhaps that is why the wolf endures so powerfully in our imagination. Not as a monster to be slain, but as a mirror we are afraid to look into for too long. Because somewhere beneath language, beneath law, beneath belief, the wolf still remembers us. And in its reflection, so do we. In the earliest memory of humankind, transformation was never gentle. It did not arrive as revelation or gift, but as ordeal. To become something more or something other, one had to first be undone. Across ancient landscapes, from ash-covered clearings to stone-ringed fires, transformation began with blood and flame, the oldest languages the human body has ever understood. Fire was not merely heat. It was judgment. It consumed weakness, burned away the familiar, and forced the initiate to stand exposed before something greater than themselves. In prehistoric ritual spaces, fire marked the border between the ordinary and the sacred. To step toward it was to step out of time. The crackling of wood, the rising smoke, the sting of heat against skin, these sensations were not symbolic embellishments. They were the ritual itself. The body learned what the mind could not yet articulate. That change is pain, and pain is passage. Blood followed fire as it always has. Blood was the proof. In ancient societies, blood was never abstract. It was life made visible. When it spilled, something real was being offered. Cuts, scarification, animal sacrifice, even self-wounding. These acts were not expressions of savagery, but of seriousness. Transformation required cost. Without it, the ritual was hollow, the boundary unbroken. Anthropological records echo this truth across continents. Among early Indo-European warrior cults, initiates endured burns, lashes, and controlled bleeding before being permitted to take on animal identities. In parts of ancient Africa and Siberia, shamans marked their bodies permanently with scars, believing the spirits would not recognize an unaltered human form. Pain reshaped the self into something legible to the unseen world. But the wound was never the goal. It was the threshold. Fire purified because it destroyed what could not endure. Blood sealed because it could not be taken back. Together, they created a moment of irreversible commitment. The initiate did not simply believe they were changed. They had paid for it with the body itself. And once the body had crossed that line, the mind followed. These rituals often unfolded at night, when the world felt thinner, and shadows stretched beyond their owners. Flames cast animal shapes against stone and bark. Drums echoed heartbeats. Smoke blurred faces until the familiar became uncertain. In this liminal space, identity loosened its grip. Names fell away. Human posture softened into crouch and prowl. Breath deepened, timed to something older than speech. The initiate did not imagine becoming something else. They rehearsed it, physically, relentlessly, until the old self grew quiet. Fire was also a teacher. It reminded humans of their smallness. No matter how skilled the hunter or how strong the warrior, flame remained untamable. To endure its presence without flinching was to prove readiness, to show the spirits, the elders, and oneself that fear had been confronted and survived. In many cultures, only those who could stand close to fire without retreat were considered capable of transformation. Fear once mastered became fuel. Blood, by contrast, bound the initiate to consequence. Once drawn, it connected them to lineage, land, and death. In some traditions, blood was mixed with ash or soil, returning life to the earth in exchange for borrowed power. In others, it marked the body so the community would recognize the change even after the ritual ended. These marks were not decorations. They were warnings and reminders. You have crossed something. You cannot return untouched. And yet, the most profound change occurred beyond the reach of flame and blade. The initiate emerged looking nearly the same. The bones had not reshaped. The skin still bore human texture. But something essential had shifted. Their relationship to violence, fear, and instinct had been reordered. They had learned what it meant to endure, to surrender control, to inhabit a state where reason dimmed and sensation ruled. This was not madness, it was rehearsal. A controlled descent into the animal mind, undertaken so it would not overwhelm them later. Psychologically, these rituals accomplished something precise. They dismantled the ego at a moment when identity was still forming. By placing the initiate in extreme sensory environments, heat, pain, exhaustion, the mind detached from its usual narratives. In that space, new frameworks could be installed. Loyalty to the group, acceptance of death, comfort with bloodshed, reverence for forces beyond human law. Transformation, then, was not escape from humanity. It was preparation for its hardest demands. Civilizations that relied on hunting, warfare, and survival in hostile environments could not afford fragile minds. These rituals forged individuals capable of acting without hesitation, of entering danger without paralysis. The animal form, wolf, bear, lion, was a psychological map. It offered a structure for behavior when words failed. Fire and blood were not metaphors to these cultures. They were technologies, tools used to rewire perception and behavior long before science gave those processes names. But there was also loss. Once transformed, the initiate could never fully return to innocence. Having confronted pain intentionally, fear no longer carried the same authority. This distance from ordinary human vulnerability created both strength and isolation. In many myths, transformed individuals lived at the edges of society, respected but feared. They had crossed a line others could not or would not. Over time, as societies grew more complex and less dependent on raw survival, these rituals began to unsettle the very cultures that created them. What once protected the group now threatened its order. Fire and blood, uncontrolled, became dangerous. Transformation, once sacred, began to look like instability. And so meaning shifted. What had been purification became transgression. What had been initiation became suspicion. The altered individual was no longer a guardian, but a risk. Stories reframed the transformed as cursed, possessed, or damned. The ritual memory survived, but its purpose was forgotten. Yet traces remain. In every myth of the beast within, there is an echo of firelight on skin. In every tale of blood sealing a curse, there is the ghost of an ancient vow. The fear we feel toward transformation is not born of fantasy. It is inherited, passed down from a time when becoming something else was necessary, and never safe. Fire still fascinates us because it strips away pretense. Blood still unsettles us because it reveals cost. Together, they remind us that identity is not fixed, but forged, and that the forging leaves scars. In the end, the initiate did not become an animal. They became someone who knew how close the animal always was. Someone who had felt the boundary burn, and stepped across it anyway. And once you have stood in that heat, once you have watched your own blood darken the earth, the world never fully looks the same again. In the deep forests beyond the reach of villages, where paths dissolved into roots and shadow, youth was expected to disappear. Not metaphorically, not gently, but completely. Across ancient societies, there came a moment when childhood was no longer tolerated, yet adulthood had not been earned. This liminal space, this dangerous in-between, was where transformation began. The boy was taken from the known world and carried into isolation, into wilderness, into ritual darkness. What followed was not education but erasure. To become a warrior, one first had to stop being human. Anthropologists would later call these rites of passage, initiation rituals. But for those who endured them, they were closer to symbolic death. Names were stripped away. Hair was cut or left to grow wild. Clothing was replaced with skins, ash, or nothing at all. The initiate was no longer addressed as a son, a child, or a member of the tribe. He was something unfinished, something unstable, something closer to a beast. Among Indo-European tribes, young men were sent into forests for months, or even years, where they lived apart from human law. In Spartan society, boys were forced into the wild during the agoj, expected to survive by theft and cunning, punished not for stealing but for being caught. Among Germanic and Norse cultures, young warriors joined wolf or bear brotherhoods, Ulfhedner and Berserker, where they adopted animal identities as sacred roles, not metaphors. These were not games of courage. They were controlled descents into savagery. In the forest, time behaved differently. Days blurred. Hunger sharpened perception. Fear became a teacher rather than an enemy. Initiates learned to track silently, to sleep lightly, to read the subtle language of broken branches and disturbed earth. They hunted not with ritual reverence, but with desperation. Blood on their hands was no longer symbolic. It was necessary. Violence was not condemned. It was curated. To live like an animal was to abandon the protective fiction of civilization. There were no elders to intervene, no laws to soften consequence. Injury meant weakness. Weakness meant death. In this crucible, empathy narrowed, instincts widened, and the self fractured into something harder, colder, and more enduring. Psychologically, this was not accidental. Modern studies of initiation rites suggest that extreme stress and isolation induce dissociation, a splitting of identity that allows the individual to endure trauma while reshaping their sense of self. Ancient cultures, without the language of neuroscience, understood this intuitively. They did not train warriors by instruction alone. They broke them, then rebuilt them. The boy who entered the forest was not expected to return unchanged. In many cases, he was not expected to return at all. Some initiates died, lost to hunger, exposure, predators, or violence. Their deaths were not always mourned publicly. Failure in these systems was part of the ritual economy. Survival itself became proof of worth. The forest chose who was allowed back. And when the survivors returned, they were no longer boys. They came back marked by scars, by silence, by an unsettling intensity. Their gaze lingered too long. Their laughter was rare. In some cultures, they were forbidden from speaking for days or weeks, as if language itself had to be relearned. Only after ritual cleansing, water, fire, blood, were they reintegrated into society. But reintegration was never complete. The initiate had learned something civilization preferred to forget, that beneath law and kinship, beneath gods and oaths, survival ruled all things. He had felt what it was like to exist without protection, without identity, without mercy. That knowledge made him dangerous, but also necessary. Societies depended on such men. Warriors who could kill without hesitation. Hunters who could pursue without remorse. guardians who could stand at the edge of human order and meet chaos on its own terms. The beast was not eradicated. It was harnessed. Yet this transformation came at a cost. Many myths speak of initiates who struggled to return fully to human life. Figures who lingered at the margins. Wild men, outcasts, wolf children, feral heroes. In some traditions, these men were revered as sacred protectors. In others, they were feared as unstable, unpredictable, cursed. The boundary between ritual transformation and permanent loss was thin. Over time, as societies grew more complex and centralized, these rites became increasingly uncomfortable. Kingdoms required obedience more than ferocity. Laws demanded predictability, not wildness. The forest, once a sacred training ground, became a symbol of danger, regression, and moral threat. And so the narrative shifted. What was once a necessary ordeal became a warning. The initiate who lived as an animal was no longer a future warrior. He was a cautionary tale. A man who abandoned society did not return stronger. He returned corrupted. This is where myth began to change its language. The young man who wore skins became the man who believed he was an animal. The disciplined descent into savagery became madness. The ritual death became a curse. Slowly, deliberately, the sacred beast was rewritten as the monstrous one. The werewolf was not born in the forest. It was born when civilization decided it could no longer tolerate the ritual that created it. Yet the memory endured. Even today, echoes of these initiations remain. In military training, in hazing rituals, in extreme endurance challenges designed to strip identity and rebuild it through suffering. The logic persists. Pain transforms. Isolation clarifies. Survival proves worth. But we no longer name the beast. We pretend the transformation is psychological, not mythic. We speak of resilience, not ritual death. And yet, the shape of the process remains unchanged. To belong, something must be lost. In the ancient world, youth was not gently guided into adulthood. It was hunted out of them. The boy died so the warrior could live. And in the dark, watching eyes of the forest, humanity learned that becoming human had always required passing through something inhuman first. The beast was never an enemy. It was the threshold. In the half-lit margins of ancient history, there are figures who do not fit comfortably within the boundaries of myth or medicine. They stand trembling between the sacred and the broken, their eyes wide with something older than reason. They were not initiates by choice, nor shamans by discipline. They were seized, by gods, by fear, by something within the mind that surged beyond restraint. Long before the language of psychology existed, humanity already knew their faces, called them blessed, called them cursed. Often it called them both. Across the cold landscapes of the ancient north, Roman chroniclers wrote with unease of warriors who entered battle not as men, but as storms. They wore animal skins, not as symbols, but as thresholds. Wolves, bears, creatures feared and revered in equal measure. These warriors did not march. They erupted. Witnesses described how they howled like beasts, struck shields with their teeth, and rushed headlong into blades without flinching. Wounds that should have crippled them seemed to pass unnoticed. Pain did not speak to them. Fear did not reach them. The Norse would later call them berserker, bear shirts, men who fought beneath the skin of the animal. But the word is a shadow of the experience itself. Ancient sources struggle to describe what these men became in those moments. They were not pretending. They were not performing ritual alone. Something in them broke open. Their humanity loosened its grip. In Icelandic sagas, the berserker state is described as a transformation of the senses. Vision narrowed. Sound thickened. The body grew hot then cold. Strength surged beyond normal limits, followed by exhaustion so deep it resembled death. When the frenzy passed, survivors often collapsed, shaking, unable to speak. Some remembered nothing. Others remembered too much. To modern eyes, this looks like madness, an uncontrolled psychological episode fueled by stress, belief, and perhaps substances unknown. But to the ancient world, explanation did not begin in the brain. It began in the spirit. Possession was not a metaphor. It was a framework for understanding the unbearable intensity of altered states. When a man moved beyond pain, beyond fear, beyond his own name, something else had entered him. A god, an ancestor, an animal spirit older than language. To be seized in this way was terrifying, but it was also meaningful. Chaos without meaning is unbearable. So meaning was given. The Greeks understood this paradox well. They feared mania, yet they revered it. The word itself, mu alpha, did not simply mean madness. It meant a state of divine imbalance, a mind pushed beyond its mortal limits. The followers of Dionysus, god of wine and dissolution, entered ritual ecstasy that dissolved identity. In the mountains, away from cities and laws, they danced until exhaustion, tore animals apart with bare hands, and felt themselves become more than human, and less. To the Greeks, reason was a fragile wall. On one side stood order, law, and civilization. On the other, something older, darker, and necessary. Dionysian madness was dangerous because it revealed how thin that wall truly was. The Romans, inheritors of Greek thought and enemies of chaos, viewed such states with suspicion. They recorded them not as sacred, but as threats. Tacitus described Germanic warriors who fought as if possessed, immune to pain, driven by fury rather than strategy. To Rome, this was barbarism, the absence of discipline, the failure of reason. Yet even in condemnation there is fear. And beneath fear, recognition. Because Rome knew this state as well. In times of crisis, Roman soldiers experienced what we might now call battle trance. Heartbeats syncopated with drums. Vision narrowed. The body moved before thought. Survival demanded it. The difference was not the state itself, but the story told about it afterward. Rome denied possession, called it courage, discipline, but the sensation was the same. Across cultures, similar figures emerge. Celtic warriors who fought naked, smeared with ash and blood, screaming into the clash of iron. Scythian fighters who inhaled smoke and entered visions before battle. Steppe nomads whose rituals blurred intoxication and prayer. Everywhere humans learned that under certain conditions, fear, belief, rhythm, isolation, the mind could fracture into something else. And in that fracture, transformation occurred. Yet not all who crossed this threshold returned whole. Ancient texts hint at the cost. Warriors who could not re-enter ordinary life. Men who remained volatile, distant, consumed by the memory of becoming something other. Communities both honored and feared them. They were protectors but also risks. Living reminders that the animal state could surface without warning. This is where reverence turns to dread. Because possession, once sacred, became unpredictable. Not all frenzy happened in battle or ritual. Some arrived uninvited. Sudden rages. Uncontrolled violence. Men who claimed to see themselves as wolves, bears, or dogs. Roman physician Galen wrote of patients afflicted by lycanthropia, a condition in which men wandered at night, convinced they were beasts. Their bodies remained human. Their minds did not. To ancient medicine, this was an imbalance of humors. To folklore, it was something else entirely. The line between sacred possession and pathological madness was never clear. Shifted with culture, with fear, with power. What one age called divine, another called diseased. What one tribe honored, another executed. But the experience itself did not vanish, it persisted because it was real. Modern psychology offers explanations: dissociation, adrenaline, trauma, group-induced trance. Neuroscience maps how extreme stress can mute pain, alter perception, and fragment identity. Yet even with this knowledge, something remains elusive. Because these states are not merely chemical. They are meaning-filled. They are shaped by expectation, belief, and cultural permission. A man who believes the god has entered him will experience the state differently than one who believes he is losing his mind. Belief does not just explain experience, it shapes it. This is why ancient possession rituals mattered. They created containers for chaos. They told the mind how to fall apart safely. When those containers collapsed, when ritual was outlawed, when belief was stripped away, what remained was raw fracture. Madness without meaning. Frenzy without reverence. By the medieval period, this distinction hardened. Ecstatic states became suspect. Possession was no longer ambiguous, it was demonic. The same behaviors once linked to gods were now evidence of sin. The berserker became the werewolf. The initiate became the monster. But beneath these changing masks, the same human truth endured. There are moments when the mind, under pressure too great to bear, escapes itself. When identity loosens. When something ancient surfaces, not as a creature of myth, but as a survival mechanism older than civilization. In those moments, humans glimpse a version of themselves ungoverned by law, memory, or fear. And that glimpse is terrifying, because it suggests that the beast was never outside us. It was always waiting, patient, wordless, and powerful, just beneath the skin. In ancient times, we called it possession and built rituals around its return. Today we call it madness and build walls instead. But the experience has not changed. Only the story we tell ourselves afterward. And somewhere in the silence after the frenzy fades, when the body aches and the mind trembles, the old question remains. In the age of stone and forest, transformation had once been a language of survival. It was spoken in blood and breath, in trance and ritual, in the quiet understanding that humanity was not separate from the animal world, but nested within it. Yet when stone gave way to marble, and villages hardened into cities, that language began to sound like a threat. Rome rose not from wilderness, but against it. At the edges of the Mediterranean, where roads were straight and laws were carved into tablets, the wild no longer symbolized wisdom or ancestral memory. It became disorder, a reminder of everything civilization claimed to have conquered. And with that shift came a profound redefinition of the human body itself. No longer a vessel capable of crossing boundaries, it was now a thing to be disciplined, regulated, and kept firmly within its prescribed form. The Roman world prized control above all else, control of land, of people, of time, and of the self. To be Roman was to be measured, rational, right. The ideal citizen was governed by reason, not instinct, by law, not appetite. In this carefully constructed identity, there was no room for ritual transformation. To become animal, even symbolically, was to abandon the very foundations of Roman order. What earlier cultures had honored as sacred metamorphosis, Rome named degeneration. Beyond the empire's borders lived those the Romans called Berberi, a word that mimicked what Roman ears heard in foreign tongues, incoherent, animalistic noise. These were the people of forests and marshes, of fur cloaks and untamed hair. They hunted differently. They worshipped differently. And most disturbingly to Roman sensibilities, they still practiced rites that blurred the line between man and beast. Among Germanic tribes, warriors donned wolf and bear skins before battle. Among Celtic peoples, initiation rituals sent youths into the wilderness to live as animals, shedding their human names and returning changed. To those within these cultures, such acts were not chaos, but continuity, a way of aligning the human spirit with forces older than stone walls and senate halls. To Rome, they were proof of savagery. Roman historians described these rites with thinly veiled horror. Tacitus wrote of warriors who fought with animal fury, men who seemed possessed, their eyes empty of reason. Pliny catalogued stories of men who became wolves, not as myth, but as grotesque curiosities from the uncivilized fringes. The tone was never neutral. These were not alternate ways of being human. They were warnings. Rome did not merely reject transformation, it feared what it revealed. Because beneath the armor of civilization, Rome recognized something uncomfortably familiar. The wild man was not an alien creature. He was a mirror. A reminder that instinct could not be legislated away, only suppressed. That beneath the toga and the law, the human body still carried ancient rhythms, of hunger, aggression, and ecstasy. And so, the empire responded as empires always do when confronted with what they cannot fully erase. It reframed. Ritual transformation became moral failure. Animal symbolism became proof of inner weakness. To lose oneself to instinct was no longer a spiritual act, but a descent, a falling away from humanity into something lesser. The beast was no longer a teacher. It was a warning sign. This shift was not merely cultural. It was political. An empire built on expansion could not afford reverence for the wild. Forests were to be cleared, rivers bridged, mountains crossed. The untamed world was an obstacle to progress, just as untamed humans were obstacles to order. By labeling transformation rites as barbaric, Rome justified conquest not only of land, but of identity itself. Civilization, Rome insisted, was salvation. Yet even within the empire, the wild refused to vanish entirely. In the arena, Romans gathered to watch men fight beasts, and beasts fight men. These spectacles were framed as demonstrations of dominance, human mastery over nature. But the crowds were drawn not only by victory, but by proximity, by the electric fear that surged when the boundary wavered, when a man bled and screamed like an animal, when the beast looked almost human in its suffering. The wild was staged, controlled, and consumed, but never truly gone. In Roman religion, too, the old symbols lingered uneasily. Mars, god of war, was sacred to the wolf. Rome's own founding myth began with Romulus and Remus suckled by a she-wolf, a quiet confession that the empire's roots lay not in marble, but in fur and fawn. Even as Rome condemned the wild man, it carried his shadow at its origin. This contradiction haunted the Roman psyche. Philosophers spoke endlessly of reason as the highest human virtue, yet wrote anxiously about passions that overwhelmed the mind. Physicians categorized madness as an excess of animal humors. Poets warned of men undone by rage, lust, or bloodlust, moments when the inner beast broke its chains. Transformation, once a ritual, became a pathology. The wild man was no longer someone who crossed boundaries intentionally. He was someone who failed to maintain them. And failure in Rome was dangerous. A citizen who could not govern himself threatened the stability of all. By redefining transformation as loss of control, Rome reshaped the myth for centuries to come. The sacred animal rites of older cultures did not disappear, but they retreated into rumor, accusation, and fear. What had once been taught became whispered. What had once been honored became prosecuted. The forest was pushed farther away, both geographically and psychologically. Yet the fear lingered. Because repression does not destroy instinct, it distorts it. The more Rome insisted on rational order, the more monstrous the idea of losing it became. The wild man transformed in the Roman imagination from initiate to threat, from seeker to savage. This was the moment when transformation began its long descent into horror. Not because humans stopped believing in the animal within, but because they were taught to hate it. And so, as the empire stretched across continents, its greatest conquest was not of land, but of meaning. Transformation was stripped of its sacred language and rewritten as a story of collapse. To become beast was no longer to remember something ancient. It was to fall away from humanity itself. But beneath the roads and laws, beneath the temples and triumphs, the old memory endured. Because no empire, however vast, can fully silence what lives in the human body. The wild man did not vanish. He waited, rebranded, misunderstood, and feared, until history would give him a new name. And when Rome finally fell, its walls crumbling back into earth, the forests remained, patient, watching, remembering. In the long twilight between eras, something ancient began to wither. The forest still breathed. The wolves still sang to the moon. The old stories still lingered in the soil and smoke. But the meaning behind them was changing. Slowly, quietly, as if the world itself were being retranslated into a harsher language. For millennia, transformation had been sacred. To become animal was not to fall. It was to remember. The beast was not beneath the human, but beside it. A brother of sinew and instinct. A mirror of survival, hunger, and awe. In trance, in ritual, in myth, The boundary between flesh and fur dissolved not as a curse, but as a communion. But as Christianity spread across Europe, the old grammar of the soul was rewritten. The forest was no longer a sanctuary. The animal was no longer a teacher. And transformation, once a bridge, became a crime against heaven. Where pagan cosmology saw the world as alive with spirits, Christianity arrived bearing a sharper division. The sacred and the profane, the human and the beast, the saved and the damned. Creation was no longer a chorus of voices. It was a hierarchy. And at its center stood a singular, jealous God, intolerant of rivals both divine and symbolic. The old gods did not vanish. They were recast. Horns became proof of corruption. Claws became weapons of sin. Fur became the uniform of the fallen. Pan, once a god of wild joy and fertile chaos, was slowly carved into the silhouette of the devil. His hooves and horns, once signs of vitality, were reimagined as marks of moral failure. The animal body, once holy in its honesty, was reduced to a vessel of temptation. The wilderness itself became suspect, a place not of revelation but of exile. To transform now meant to descend. Christian theology framed the human soul as a battleground, caught between divine order and bestial impulse. Appetite became dangerous. Desire became evidence. Instinct became the whisper of Satan. Where ancient peoples had sought union with animal strength, Christian moral thought urged domination over it. The beast was no longer something one could become. It was something one must resist. And when resistance failed, the punishment was eternal. This shift was not merely symbolic. It was psychological. Christianity did not erase humanity's animal nature. Condemned it. The wolf still lived inside the mind, but now it crouched in shadow, unnamed and feared. The trance of the shaman became the possession of the sinner. The vision quest became heresy. The ecstatic dance became proof of corruption. Transformation did not disappear. It went underground. By the early medieval period, stories of human-to-beast metamorphosis returned, not as sacred myths but as confessions. Men claimed to walk as wolves not because the spirits called them, but because the devil had answered. Women were said to fly not because they knew the old herbs and stars, but because they had signed their names in blood. The language changed. The experience remained. Where once a man might have said, "I became the wolf to protect my people," he now said, "I was tempted and I fell." The act was the same. The meaning was inverted. This is how the werewolf was reborn. No longer a guardian of borders or a warrior of winter, the werewolf became a moral warning, a sermon with teeth. Medieval bestiaries and church sermons painted the transformed man as a cautionary figure, one who surrendered reason to appetite, soul to flesh. To become beast was to abandon God's image. It was the ultimate regression, from salvation back into mud and blood. Yet these stories flourished not because people believed them blindly, but because they resonated. The Middle Ages were an age of hunger, plague, of forests pressing close to villages like watching eyes. Wolves were real. Violence was intimate. Survival demanded instincts Christianity could not erase, but could not comfortably acknowledge either. So the terror of animality found a new outlet. Trials across Europe tell the same quiet story beneath the accusations. Men confessed to becoming wolves after famine stripped them of humanity. Women were accused of witchcraft after surviving alone, outside community, beyond protection. Those who lived too close to nature, too far from authority, were marked as spiritually contaminated. Transformation became a language for fear. The devil, in Christian cosmology, did not create. He corrupted. He did not invent beasts, he used them. Thus, becoming animal was framed as diabolical mimicry, a false transformation, an unholy parody of divine creation. To change shape was to lie with the enemy of order itself. But beneath the theology, something older persisted. The people accused of becoming beasts were often the poor, the traumatized, the isolated. Their transformations mirrored psychological collapse, dissociation, hunger-induced hallucination, identity fracture. What the church named sin, the body named survival. The wolf returned when the human world failed. Christianity did not invent the fear of the beast within. It gave it a courtroom, a language of guilt, and a destination, hell. And yet, even as doctrine hardened, folklore resisted. In rural villages, whispers endured of wolves who punished cruelty, of shapeshifters who protected borders, of cursed men who wept after their transformations, ashamed not of the beast, but of what had driven them there. These were not tales of evil, but of tragedy, of humanity torn between heaven's demand and earth's reality. The Church preached salvation through separation, from instinct, from wilderness, from the animal past. But the human psyche could not obey so cleanly. The old spirit did not die. It was buried alive. By calling transformation sin, Christianity forced it into shadow. And in shadow it grew teeth. What was once ritual became repression. What was once reverence became fear. What was once balance became war. The werewolf was no longer a bridge between worlds. It was a fracture made flesh. And in this fracture, Western civilization learned something dangerous. That to be human was to deny part of oneself. That salvation required severance. That the body was suspect, and instinct a threat. Yet the persistence of these myths suggests a quiet rebellion. Even condemned transformation refused to vanish. It resurfaced in nightmares, in folklore, in art, in whispered confessions. Because no matter how fiercely religion tried to exile the beast, humanity could not fully abandon its reflection. The forest still waited beyond the village lights. The wolf still watched from the tree line. And somewhere inside the human soul, the old question remained. Was the beast a fall from grace? Or a memory of what we once were, before heaven taught us to fear the earth? In the end, sin did not replace spirit. It only renamed it. In the half-light of medieval Europe, where candle flame trembled against stone and parchment, law was not merely a system of rules. It was a ritual, an attempt to bind the chaos of the world into words, seals, and judgments. Beyond the walls of cities, forests breathed with older rhythms, and within the human heart, something equally ancient stirred. It was here, in this uneasy borderland between order and instinct, that the wolfman entered the courtroom. To the modern ear, the idea feels impossible. Transformation myths, we are told, belong to folktales and firesides, not legal codes and judges' benches. Yet medieval courts did not laugh at claims of metamorphosis. They did not dismiss them as superstition. They prosecuted them. Not because the judges believed men literally grew fur beneath the moon, but because the accusation of becoming a beast named a deeper terror, one that law was designed to confront. The Middle Ages inherited a worldview in which the universe was moral, animated, and fragile. Every act rippled outward. Sin stained not only the soul but the land itself. Famine, plague, and war were not random calamities. They were symptoms of imbalance. In such a world, the boundary between human and animal was not fixed. It was porous, negotiated daily through hunger, violence, and fear. The wolf stood at the center of this anxiety. For rural communities, it was not a symbol but a presence. Watching from the tree line, stealing livestock, sometimes dragging children into the dark. Wolves were competitors, rivals in survival. They mirrored humanity's own predatory needs, stripped of speech and sacrament. To accuse a man of becoming a wolf was not to claim magic alone. It was to say that he had crossed an ethical threshold, abandoning the obligations of human society. Medieval law understood crime as a rupture of order, not merely a violation of statute. A murderer was not just someone who killed. He was someone who had torn the fabric of community. And so, when a person was accused of wolfish transformation, the court was less concerned with the mechanics of the change than with its meaning. Had this person surrendered to appetite? Had he allowed instinct to rule where conscience should have stood guard? Records survive, cold, meticulous, unsettling. In 15th and 16th century France, Germany, and the Baltic regions, men and women were tried for lycanthropy alongside charges of murder, cannibalism, and sacrilege. Witnesses spoke of glowing eyes in the forest, of bodies found torn apart, of tracks that seemed half human, half animal. Confessions followed, often extracted under torture, describing salves, belts of wolfskin, and nocturnal hunts beneath the moon. Yet even here, amid cruelty and fear, the courts revealed their true concern. Sentences were not passed for believing oneself a wolf. They were passed for acting like one. The accused were punished for crimes committed against the social body: infanticide, assault, desecration. The wolf man was a legal metaphor made flesh, a human who had rejected restraint. In a society where survival depended on cooperation, where harvests were shared and labor was collective, unchecked instinct was the ultimate crime. This fear was not abstract. Medieval life was lived close to the edge of starvation. Hunger was a constant companion, whispering to the body to take, to consume, to survive at any cost. The wolf embodied that whisper. It was hunger with teeth. The law, then, became a theater where society reassured itself that the beast could be named, judged, and destroyed. Trials were public spectacles, moral dramas staged to remind communities of the price of surrendering to impulse. When a wolf man was condemned, it was not only the individual who was punished. It was the idea that one could live outside the human covenant. Religion sharpened this logic. Christian theology taught that humanity was fallen but redeemable, poised between angel and animal. To become beast-like was to move backward, away from grace. Church and court intertwined, interpreting lycanthropy as both crime and sin, a willful descent into the flesh. Yet there is another layer, quieter and more tragic. Many of those accused lived on the margins: shepherds, woodcutters, the poor, the mentally ill. They were people whose lives already brushed against the wild. Isolation bred rumor. Difference invited suspicion. In times of crisis, failed harvests, outbreaks of disease, the community searched for a cause that could be seen and punished. The wolf man was convenient. He gave fear a face. Modern psychology offers words medieval courts did not have: dissociation, psychosis, trauma. Some accused spoke of overwhelming urges, of losing themselves to something vast and uncontrollable. In a world without medical language for such experiences, myth stepped in where science could not. The court translated inner collapse into moral failure. Still, it would be a mistake to imagine medieval judges as simple-minded believers in fairy tales. Many legal scholars of the time debated whether transformation was literal or illusionary, demonic or psychological. But the verdict rarely changed. Because the point of the trial was never to solve the mystery of metamorphosis. It was to restore order. By condemning the wolfman, society drew a line in the dirt and called it human. And yet, the persistence of these trials suggests something unresolved. If the beast could be eradicated so easily, why did it return again and again, across centuries and borders? Why did communities continue to tell stories of men who ran on four legs, who tasted blood and could not stop? Because the wolfman was never entirely outside the village walls. He lived in the tension between need and restraint, between survival and morality. He was the embodiment of a question every society must answer. What happens when the rules that bind us no longer hold? Law attempted to answer with fire and rope. Myth answered with fur and moonlight. Both were responses to the same unease, the recognition that civilization is a thin garment, worn lightly over older skin. As Europe moved toward the modern age, these trials faded. Courts grew skeptical. Science reframed the mind. The wolf retreated into storybooks and nightmares. But the fear did not vanish. It only changed shape. Today we no longer try men for becoming beasts. We prosecute violence, obsession, loss of control. We still search for explanations when humans act in ways that terrify us. And we still speak, quietly, of monsters. In the medieval courtroom, beneath the gaze of judges and the weight of scripture, the wolfman stood not as proof of magic, but as a warning. A reminder that law exists not because humanity is good, but because it is fragile. That beneath every oath and statute, something older waits, listening, hungry, patient. And in that understanding lies the true legacy of the wolfman, not a creature of legend, but a mirror held up to the human condition, reflecting the cost of forgetting who we are when the forest grows too close and the night feels endless. In the long dusk between belief and memory, something ancient changed its shape. There was a time when transformation was not feared, when the boundary between human and animal was not a wound, but a threshold. In forests older than language, people did not imagine themselves as separate from the living world. They borrowed its strength, wore its instincts like a second skin, and returned altered, not diminished but renewed. To become the wolf was once an act of reverence. But by the time the werewolf entered folklore as we now recognize it, the meaning had turned inward and dark. The sacred had curdled into the profane. What was once a ritual of becoming had become a sentence of exile. The wolf no longer walked beside humanity, it hunted it. This inversion did not happen all at once. It unfolded slowly, like rot beneath bark. In the earliest strata of Indo-European myth, the wolf was not a monster but a teacher. Warriors painted their bodies, wore pelts, and entered altered states to embody the animal's ferocity and discipline. In Arcadia, men were said to become wolves not as punishment, but as part of sacred rites tied to Zeus Lycaon, rituals that blurred the line between god, beast, and mortal. Among the Norse, the berserker and the Ulfnar wrapped themselves in wolfskins, surrendering their individual selves to something older and more violent than identity. These were not tales meant to terrify children. They were instructions. They taught when to cross the boundary, and when to return. Transformation, in these early worlds, was a language of survival. To become animal was to remember hunger, winter, and the thinness of flesh. It was to acknowledge that civilization was a fragile shelter built against an uncaring earth. The wolf was not evil. It was honest. But cultures change when fear outpaces understanding. As agrarian societies replaced nomadic ones, the forest receded. Wolves were no longer companions at the edge of myth. They were competitors. They hunted the same herds. They lingered near villages during famine. Their howls threaded through nights already heavy with hunger and disease. The animal that once symbolized communion with nature now represented its threat. At the same time, belief itself hardened. Ritual gave way to doctrine. Pagan ambiguity was replaced by moral certainty. The old gods faded, and with them the idea that humans could move fluidly between states of being. In its place rose a rigid hierarchy: human above animal, soul above instinct, order above wildness. Transformation without divine permission became transgression. And so the wolfman returned, but not as a teacher, as a warning. In medieval Europe, the werewolf emerged as a creature of curse and contagion. No longer chosen but afflicted. No longer sacred but damned. The stories told of men who slipped their skins under moonlight, driven not by ritual but by compulsion. Their change was involuntary, their violence shameful, their return to human form soaked in guilt and blood. This was not mythology evolving, it was psychology breaking through narrative. The werewolf became a vessel for anxieties the age could not name. In a world governed by Christian morality, the idea that the animal still lived inside the human was unbearable. Desire, rage, hunger, these were no longer natural forces to be managed, but sins to be suppressed. When repression failed, the story supplied a monster. The beast was no longer outside the village. It was inside the man. Historical records tell us that accusations of lycanthropy often followed familiar patterns. They arose during periods of famine, war, and plague, times when social order frayed and survival demanded brutality. Men who committed violence beyond explanation were not understood as products of trauma or starvation. They were understood as transformed. In 16th century France, men like Gilles Garnier were executed not simply for murder, but for becoming wolves. Their confessions, extracted through torture, echo the language of possession and loss of self. They spoke of ointments, of moonlit fields, of an irresistible pull toward flesh. What they described was not magic. It was dissociation. The werewolf myth absorbed real psychological fracture. Hunger-induced psychosis, post-war trauma, the mind splitting under moral pressure it could not survive, the body acting while the self watched from a distance. To medieval society, this was not illness, it was proof of corruption. The wolf had become the shape of forbidden truth. Even the moon, once a symbol of cycles and fertility, became complicit. Its light no longer guided planting or ritual. It exposed. Under its glare, the hidden self was revealed. The lunar transformation mirrored the terror of losing control, of becoming something unrecognizable, something that violated the fragile identity of man. This is why the werewolf does not simply kill. It remembers killing. Unlike other monsters, the werewolf returns to human form burdened with memory. The horror is not just the violence, it is the knowledge that the violence came from within. That the hands that held children also tore flesh. That the mind that preyed also hunted. The myth insists on guilt. In this way, the werewolf is not a creature of darkness, but of conscience. It is the embodiment of moral fracture, the terror that civilization is only a mask, and that beneath it waits something ancient, patient, and unsatisfied. As the centuries passed, the old ritual meanings were erased entirely. The wolf was severed from its sacred roots. What remained was the cautionary tale, a story told to keep people inside the fence, inside the law, inside themselves. Do not wander. Do not hunger. Do not become. But myths do not vanish when their meanings are buried. They linger, distorted but alive. The werewolf survived because it spoke a truth no era could fully silence, that the boundary between human and animal is thinner than comfort allows. That identity is not fixed. That under pressure, the self can fracture, and something older can emerge. The birth of the werewolf myth, then, is not the creation of a monster. It is the moment a culture turned away from its own reflection. When it decided that the animal within was not a teacher, but a threat. Not a memory but a curse. And yet, beneath every warning told by firelight, beneath every sermon and execution, the oldest story still breathes. It waits in the forest of the mind. In the places where hunger sharpens perception. Where fear strips away language. Where survival demands honesty. The wolf has never left us. It has only changed the way we speak its name. Night has always been humanity's oldest mirror. When the fire dims and the borders of the village dissolve into forest, something ancient stirs in the silence. It is not a howl, not yet. It is a memory, older than language, older than law, reminding us that the world was once ruled by teeth, hunger, and the pulse of blood beneath the skin. The werewolf does not emerge from myth as a monster alone. It emerges as a confession. Long before stone cities rose and borders were drawn, humans lived at the mercy of the wild. Survival demanded alertness, aggression, and a willingness to kill. These instincts were not moral failures, they were necessities. To hesitate was to die. To soften was to starve. In that distant world, the animal was not an enemy. It was an inheritance. But civilizations are built on forgetting. As agriculture replaced the hunt and laws replaced instinct, humanity learned a new skill: restraint. Violence was no longer admired, it was regulated. Desire was no longer sacred, it was suspect. The animal within us did not disappear. It was disciplined, named, and buried beneath ritual and rule. Yet repression has never been the same as erasure. In medieval Europe, the werewolf began to haunt the margins of belief. Not as fantasy but as accusation. Court records speak of men tried for lycanthropy, accused of abandoning God and law to roam as beasts. These were not fairy tales whispered to children. They were legal proceedings, sermons, and public executions. The werewolf was treated as a criminal condition, a moral collapse so severe it transformed the soul itself. The church framed lycanthropy as a spiritual failure. To become a wolf was to surrender reason, to reject divine order, to embrace the animal God had commanded humanity to rise above. And yet, the more fiercely civilization condemned the beast, the more vividly it appeared in story and dream. Because the wolf was not foreign. It was familiar. Wolves hunted in packs. So did soldiers. Wolves defended territory. So did kingdoms. Wolves killed to survive. So did peasants in famine. The line between man and beast was thinner than doctrine allowed. In times of social fracture, war, plague, hunger, werewolf sightings multiplied. These were not coincidences. They were symptoms. When law collapsed, instinct resurfaced. When food vanished, neighbors turned on one another. Cannibalism appeared not as legend, but as historical record. And the mind, desperate to make sense of such acts, reached for a shape that could carry the guilt. The werewolf became a vessel, a story that allowed people to say, "It was not me. It was the beast." Psychologically, this is no accident. The human mind has always struggled to reconcile violence with identity. To acknowledge our capacity for brutality is to fracture the self. Myths offer relief. They create distance. They transform impulse into possession, desire into curse, rage into moonlight. The werewolf is not born. He is overtaken. This distinction matters. Across cultures, the transformation is rarely voluntary. It happens at night, under the full moon, in moments of loss of control. These are not arbitrary details. They are metaphors encoded with precision. Night represents anonymity. The moon represents cycles beyond human command. Transformation represents the terror of becoming someone we do not recognize. Modern psychology would later give these fears clinical names: dissociation, impulse disorders, psychosis. But long before diagnosis, myth had already mapped the terrain. Anthropologically, the werewolf reflects a transitional fear. The anxiety of becoming civilized while knowing the transformation is incomplete. Civilization asks us to suppress aggression, yet rewards it in war. It condemns predation, yet structures economies around it. It teaches morality, yet celebrates conquest. The contradiction is unresolved. And so the beast waits. Even in the modern world, illuminated, medicated, surveilled, the werewolf persists. Not because we believe men become wolves, but because we recognize the sensation. The sudden surge of rage. The loss of empathy under stress. The pleasure found in domination. The moments when civility fractures and something raw surfaces, breathing hard behind the eyes. We call it losing control. Ancient people called it the wolf. The enduring power of the werewolf myth lies in its refusal to absolve us. Unlike demons or ghosts, the werewolf is not an external invader. It is us, altered but intact. Same body, same memories, same hands, only freed from restraint. This is why the werewolf does not haunt castles or ruins. It haunts forests, roads, and thresholds, places where rules weaken and instinct reasserts itself. It appears where order ends. And perhaps that is its final lesson. Civilization is not a cure. It is a negotiation. A fragile agreement between what we are and what we pretend to be. Laws restrain behavior, but they do not rewrite biology. Morality shapes action, but it does not erase impulse. The animal within us did not vanish when we learned to build cities. It learned to wait. Waiting for fear. Waiting for hunger. Waiting for night. The werewolf survives because it speaks a truth too uncomfortable to discard. That beneath our language, beneath our ethics, beneath our carefully constructed identities, something older still breathes. Something that remembers the forest. Something that knows how to survive when rules collapse. And when the lights go out, whether by war, disaster, or despair, it does not need to be summoned. Simply steps forward. Because the beast was never left behind. It was carried with us, quietly, patiently, into the modern world, watching, remembering, and waiting for the moon to rise again.